July 21st, 1944. 8:28 a.m. 20 amphibious tractors exploded in the water before a single Marine touched the beach. Not sank. Not capsized. Exploded. Japanese artillery pre-registered on the reef had been waiting 32 months for this exact moment, and when the American landing craft crossed into range, the guns opened up with a precision that turned 20 LVTs into burning wreckage in the first 60 seconds of the assault. Marines were dying in the water. Marines were dying on the reef. Marines were dying before they could even see the enemy who was killing them. 18,337 Japanese soldiers were about to die on this island in the next 21 days. And one of the men responsible for making that happen was a tailor. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next video. Join us as we uncover more stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past. Be part of our community. Every subscriber helps us bring these forgotten histories back to life. His name was Shoichi Yokoi. He cut uniforms for a living. He had no particular gift for strategy, no formal training in combat doctrine, no experience commanding men in battle. He was a craftsman who worked with needle and thread, and the Japanese military had handed him a rifle and shipped him to a tropical island, because the empire needed bodies to fill positions, and his body was available. By January 24, 1972, 28 years after the battle that destroyed 18,000 of his comrades, Yokoi would still be alive in the jungle of Guam, eating river shrimp and rats, wearing clothing he had woven from tree bark, having survived longer alone in enemy territory than almost any soldier in recorded history. But before we get to what one tailor endured for 28 years, we have to understand what happened in 21 days, and why it happened the way it did, and why the battle that killed 18,000 Japanese soldiers was simultaneously made possible and made more expensive by the same American naval victory. Because that paradox is the center of everything. And it begins not on the beaches of Guam, but 6 weeks earlier, when an admiral made a decision that would change the cost of every American life spent taking this island back. Guam had been American territory since 1898, 30 miles long, 9 miles wide at its broadest point, with a protected harbor at Apra that the United States Navy considered the finest natural anchorage in the Western Pacific. The Chamorro people, indigenous to the Marianas, residents of this island for thousands of years before European contact, had been American nationals since the treaty that ended the Spanish-American War. They were not a strategic calculation. They were people, Americans, living on an island that the Japanese military needed. Japan took Guam on December 10, 1941. 3 hours of fighting. The American garrison was deliberately small. Pre-war planning had decided the island couldn't be defended against a serious Japanese assault, and that spending resources on its defense would be wasteful. The island fell exactly as the planners had calculated it would. The American Naval Administration departed with whoever could be evacuated. The Chamorro people, American nationals without the means or the invitation to leave, stayed behind. What followed across the next 32 months was the specific reality of military occupation applied to a civilian population. The Japanese renamed the island Omiyajima, Great Shrine Island. The Chamorro people were required to learn Japanese to bow to Japanese soldiers, to participate in a civic framework that redefined them as subjects of the empire with no standing as anything else. Forced labor on fortification projects. Beatings for non-compliance. Executions for resistance, or for the suspicion of resistance. The Catholic churches at the center of Chamorro community life were closed. Young men were assigned to dig the bunkers and tunnels and artillery emplacements that would later be used to kill the Americans coming to liberate them. The specific cruelty of occupation accumulated across 32 months in ways that touched every family on the island. Lieutenant General Takashi Takashina commanded the Guam garrison with approximately 19,000 soldiers built around the experienced 29th Division, transferred from Manchuria, supplemented by tanks, artillery in quantity, and naval infantry. He used the 32 months of occupation to build a defensive network across the western approaches of the island that represented the full development of Japanese defensive engineering in the Pacific bunkers. Artillery positions with pre-registered fires on the approach routes, anti-tank obstacles, beach obstacles, cave and tunnel systems reinforced into the characteristic fortifications that had made every previous Pacific Island assault expensive in American blood. Then something happened that gave Takashina 6 additional weeks to make those defenses even stronger. The original invasion plan called for Guam to be assaulted on June 18, 1944, 3 days after Saipan. The ground forces were in position. The fleet was ready. And then, on June 15th, Admiral Spruance received intelligence that Admiral Ozawa's fleet was approaching. The Guam invasion was cancelled. Spruance concentrated his entire force for the naval engagement that became the Battle of the Philippine Sea. June 19th and 20th, 1944. What happened next would go down in history as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. American carrier aviation destroyed Japanese carrier aviation as an offensive force in 2 days of combat. Ozawa lost 476 aircraft. The United States lost 130. Japanese naval air power built across years of training and combat experience was effectively finished as a strategic instrument. The fleet protecting the Marianas invasion was now free to operate without the threat of a massive Japanese air counterattack. The Turkey Shoot made the Guam invasion possible. It also made the Guam invasion hideously more expensive. Because while Spruance was destroying Japanese carrier aviation, the ground divisions designated as Guam's invasion reserve were being consumed in the harder-than-expected fighting on Saipan. A fresh division, the 77th Infantry from Hawaii, had to be brought forward to replace them. The 77th arrived on July 15th. Between June 15th and July 15th, 30 days passed. 30 days during which the Japanese garrison of Guam was under sustained naval and air bombardment, the longest pre-invasion bombardment of any Pacific Island campaign. 30 days during which Takashina's engineers watched which positions survived the shelling and which didn't, relocated ammunition to protected sites, deepened tunnels, reinforced overhead cover, moved artillery to positions that offered better protection from naval gunfire. The garrison that waited on July 21st was not the garrison that had been in place on June 15th. It had learned from 30 days of bombardment how to survive bombardment. The positions above Asan Beach that would sink 20 LVTs on the morning of July 21st had been improved and reinforced specifically because the delay had given the garrison time to improve them. This is the paradox at the center of the Guam campaign. The naval victory that made the landing possible made the landing more expensive, and 1,744 Americans would pay the cost of that arithmetic in the next 21 days. On the morning of July 21st, 2 simultaneous landings began. The 3rd Marine Division approached Asan Beach at 8:28 a.m., 1 minute ahead of schedule. Japanese artillery opened fire before the landing craft reached the shore. 20 LVTs sank in the water. The Marines who survived the approach came ashore under direct fire from Chonito Ridge and Buntle Ridge, elevated coral formations above the beach that looked down onto the landing zone at angles that made them extraordinarily effective for defensive fire and extraordinarily difficult to neutralize without infantry assault going straight up the rock face into the guns. 37 days of naval bombardment had not silenced them. 5 miles to the south, the 1st Provisional Marine Brigade landing at Agate Beach took even heavier casualties in the approach. The 77th Infantry Division waded from the reef edge to shore in full combat equipment across several hundred yards of open water under fire. The nightmare scenario that the Battle of Tarawa had defined for the Pacific Campaign, the specific ordeal that every subsequent assault had worked to prevent. By the end of the first day, the Marines at Asan had paid 105 dead, 536 wounded, and 56 missing for a beachhead 4,000 yards wide and approximately 1 mile deep. The 2 landing zones were 5 miles apart and not connected. The Japanese still held Apra Harbor between them. The high ground above both landing zones was still contested, and somewhere in the jungle of the island's south, a tailor named Yokoi was watching what was happening to the soldiers around him, the dying and the retreating and the systematic destruction of everything Takashina had built, and making the calculation that would keep him alive long after 18,000 of his comrades were dead. What happened on the night of July 25th would end the Japanese capacity to defend Guam in a single engagement. 3,500 men. One night. And by dawn the battle was effectively over, even though neither side fully understood it yet. In Part 2, we go inside the counterattack that Takashina launched against a marine perimeter that had been built specifically to destroy it, what it looked like from both sides of the line when 3,500 men crossed open ground in the dark toward guns that were already registered on every inch of that ground. And what the Chamorro people, who had been waiting 32 months, did when the fighting finally passed their camps and their hiding places in the hills. July 25th, 1944. 11:47 p.m. The ground is quiet, too quiet. 4 days ago, 20 LVTs burned on the reef at Asan Beach before a single Marine reached the shore. 4 days of fighting through coral ridges and jungle. 4 days of Japanese artillery dropping shells on men who had nowhere to hide. 4 days of nightly counterattacks, probing the Marine perimeter, looking for the weakness that would split the American beachhead in half. The two landing zones are finally connected. The artillery is finally registered. The fire control networks linking the ground forces to the offshore naval guns are finally operational. Takashina has 3,500 men massed in the jungle, and he is about to send every single one of them across open ground toward guns that have been waiting for exactly this moment. 18,000 Japanese soldiers will be dead in 17 more days. But tonight, the man who will make that possible is a tailor, crouching in the dark, listening to the sound of an army preparing to destroy itself. Takashina made his decision with the specific logic of a commander who understood that his options were narrowing by the hour. The nightly probing attacks had failed. The beachheads had consolidated. Every day the Americans remained ashore. More artillery came off the landing craft. More fire control teams established communications with the fleet. More of the tactical window that a mass counterattack needed was closing permanently. The doctrine was clear: commit the mobile reserve. Strike the seam between the two American units, drive through before the defensive fires could be organized, push the Marines back into the water. The doctrine had worked before. At Guadalcanal, at Tarawa, at every island where the Japanese had been able to strike in the first hours after landing before the Americans could establish fire superiority. The problem at Guam was that the first hours were gone. The Marines had been ashore for 4 days, and those 4 days had been spent doing one thing above everything else: building the exact defensive position that would destroy Takashina's reserve. The Marine Corps, by the summer of 1944, had learned from every island that came before. The lesson was always the same. The Japanese would counterattack at night. They would attack in mass, and they would attack at the seam between units. The answer was not more infantry on the line. The answer was artillery, registered on every inch of ground. A counterattack would have to cross machine guns, positioned for overlapping coverage of the open approaches, and naval fire control teams with the forward units who could call the offshore guns within minutes of any assault beginning. 4 days. That was all it took to build it. And it was ready. At 2 a.m. on July 26th, the columns crossed the open ground. Multiple simultaneous attacks striking from the jungle edge toward the junction between the 3rd Marine Division and the 1st Provisional Brigade. The choice of that junction was tactically sound. The seam between two units is always the most difficult point in any defensive line to maintain coherent coverage. A breakthrough there could split the American force completely, prevent the two beachheads from reinforcing each other, and potentially collapse the entire Guam operation. The columns were disciplined. They were experienced. The 29th Division that formed their corps had been transferred from Manchuria veterans of years of military service. These were not raw recruits charging blindly. These were soldiers executing a doctrine that had worked before, led by a general who had studied the terrain and chosen his point of attack with professional judgment. They crossed into artillery that had been calculated for exactly this ground. The guns that opened up on those columns had spent 4 days registering on every approach route, every open space, every natural avenue of assault from the jungle edge to the Marine perimeter. When the first columns appeared in the darkness, they crossed ground that the Marine artillery had already measured. The naval guns offshore, connected to forward observers by radio networks established specifically for this moment, added their weight to everything the shore-based guns were firing. The open ground between the jungle and the Marine line became something that is difficult to describe and impossible to survive in mass. Some columns penetrated the Marine perimeter. This is the part that does not appear in the simplified version of the battle. The assault was not simply stopped at the wire. Some Japanese soldiers broke through. Some of them reached the beach. Some of them got into the supply areas behind the forward positions. By the hour before dawn, Japanese soldiers were present at points well behind what had been the front line at midnight. It was a genuine tactical penetration, the kind of breakthrough that in different circumstances against a different defensive setup, against a perimeter that had not had 4 days to prepare, could have been catastrophically exploited. It was not exploited, because the Marines had prepared for this too. The penetrating columns were isolated by the fires that closed the gaps behind them. The Japanese soldiers who reached the beach had crossed the entire American defensive position, which was a real military accomplishment, and found themselves surrounded by morning with no force coming behind them, and no means of using what they had gained. The reserve that was supposed to follow through any breach and exploit the penetration was dead on the open ground. The columns that had broken through were cut off. By dawn, they were being reduced systematically from all sides. By 9 a.m. on July 26th, the ground between the jungle edge and the marine perimeter held 3,500 Japanese soldiers, all of them dead. Takashina was alive. He had committed his entire mobile reserve to a single night assault and watched it destroyed in 8 hours. What remained of the Guam garrison, perhaps 15,000 men still armed in the jungle and the ridges, was no longer the same force. The reserve was gone. And without the reserve, a static defense becomes a series of fixed positions that an attacker can approach from any direction without facing a coherent response. Every penetration, every flanking move, every breakthrough the Americans achieved from July 26th forward could not be sealed, could not be counterattacked, could not be stopped by moving forces from one threatened point to another. There were no forces to move. 2 days later, on July 28th, a machine gun burst caught Takashina while he was moving between positions. He was killed instantly. The general who had ordered the attack that cost the garrison its capacity to defend itself did not survive to account for it. Lieutenant General Hideyoshi Obata, commander of the 31st Army with his headquarters on Guam, assumed command of what remained. He inherited a dying defense. What Obata commanded was not a garrison anymore in any meaningful strategic sense. It was a fighting withdrawal. 15,000 men moving north into the mountainous jungle interior of the island trading space. For time costing the advancing Americans whatever the terrain and the defenders' stubbornness and the caves and the ridgelines could extract until there was no more island left to withdraw into. Every day of that withdrawal cost American lives. Every prepared position on every ridge, every cave system in the coral, every ambush in the plantation land and the jungle paths, all of it still lethal, all of it still capable of killing the Marines and soldiers moving through it. The organized defense was over. The killing was not. And this is the moment when the Chamorro people emerged. As the American advance pushed north and inland, the civilians who had survived 32 months of occupation began appearing at the edges of the Marine positions. They came out of the hills, out of the jungle, out of the concentration camps the garrison had established in the final weeks. They came carrying whatever they had managed to keep through 2.5 years of occupation. They came helping elderly relatives and carrying children. And they came with information. They showed Marine and Army units paths through the jungle that the military maps did not show. They reported Japanese positions with the accuracy of people who had spent 32 months living next to those positions. They guided patrols through terrain. They knew the way people know the landscape where they were born. Every ravine, every ridge, every trail through the plantation land that the military cartographers had only approximated from aerial photographs. They had been waiting for this for 32 months. When it came, they were part of it. Obata signaled the emperor from his headquarters at Mount Mataguac on August 10th. His soldiers were continuing a desperate battle with only their bare hands. The holding of Guam had become hopeless. He was overcome with sorrow for the families of his men. He asked the emperor to pray for the empire's prosperity. Then he committed suicide. General Roy Geiger declared Guam secure that same day. 18,337 Japanese dead. 1,744 Americans dead. 21 days. But in the northern jungle, one man was still alive who would not be found for 28 more years. And the clearing operations that began after August 10th would add another 8,500 Japanese deaths before the year was over. The island was declared secure. The war on that island was not finished. And Shoichi Yokoi Taylor Survivor, the last Japanese soldier on Guam, was just beginning the longest solitary vigil in the history of the Pacific War. In Part 3, we go inside what those 28 years actually looked like, and what he said when they finally found him. August 10th, 1944. Guam declared secure. 18,337 Japanese soldiers dead in 21 days. The mobile reserve destroyed in a single night. Takashina killed by machine gun fire. Obata's final signal to the emperor, then suicide. The Chamorro people emerging from the hills after 32 months of occupation, guiding Marine patrols through jungle the military maps had never accurately captured. The organized battle was over. But 8,500 Japanese soldiers were still alive in the northern jungle, still armed, still capable of killing anyone who moved through their terrain. And one man, a tailor from Ichi Prefecture, named Shoichi Yokoi, was hiding in the south in terrain the clearing operations would search and never find him, in beginning something that no military planner had anticipated, and no historical account has fully captured. The war was ending everywhere else. On Guam, for one man, it was just beginning. The clearing operations that started on August 11th were methodical and expensive. American patrols moved through the cave systems and dense vegetation of northern Guam hunting holdouts, who knew the terrain with the specific intimacy of men who had spent months building defensive positions through it. Every cave system had to be approached as a potential fortified position. Every ravine was a potential ambush. The Japanese soldiers who had withdrawn north were not surrendering. The doctrine they had internalized was absolute surrender was not available to a Japanese soldier. A man who surrendered had chosen a form of dishonor worse than death. By the end of 1944, more than 8,500 additional Japanese soldiers had been killed or captured on Guam since August 10th. The organized battle lasted 21 days. The unorganized continuation lasted another year. American patrols suffered casualties through 1944 and into 1945, hunting men in terrain that a declaration of victory had not cleared. But the strategic transformation of the island was already underway, running simultaneously with the clearing operations reshaping what Guam meant to the Pacific War, in ways that would prove more consequential than the battle itself. In January 1945, Admiral Nimitz transferred Pacific Fleet headquarters from Pearl Harbor to Guam. The harbor at Apra, the finest natural anchorage in the Western Pacific, the same harbor the Japanese had controlled since December 10, 1941, became the primary staging point for the naval offensive against the Japanese home islands. The airfields built and expanded across the island became bases for B-29 operations, alongside those on Saipan and Tinian. The three islands captured in the summer of 1944 became the platform from which the final phase of the Pacific War was prosecuted. Every strategic decision, every operational plan, every coordination between the naval and air campaigns that would eventually force Japan's surrender was planned and executed from the command structure centered on Guam. The island Japan had taken in 3 hours became the nerve center that ended the war. The Chamorro people, who had spent 32 months under occupation, watched this transformation from within their shattered communities. What remained of those communities was not much. The forced labor on Japanese fortification projects had disrupted the agricultural economy that pre-war Guam had sustained. The churches closed during the occupation were slowly reopening. The property confiscated for military use was gone. The people killed during the occupation were dead. The testimonies they gave to American military officers in August and September of 1944 produced the documentary record of what Japanese military occupation had cost a population of American citizens across 32 months. They described forced labor, beatings, public executions conducted as demonstrations of garrison authority, the concentration camps of the final weeks where conditions deteriorated as the garrison understood what was coming and stopped calculating consequences, the systematic suppression of the Chamorro identity, the language requirements, the mandatory bowing, the civic framework that redefined Americans as imperial subjects. The distance between what the Chamorro people had experienced and what American civilians on the continental United States had experienced during those same 32 months was not crossable by the official vocabulary of liberation and victory. It was real, specific, and documented. And it was the reason that when Chamorro guides led Marine patrols through jungle paths the military maps had never accurately shown, those patrols understood what they were witnessing. These were Americans who had waited 32 months for this. When it came, they were part of it. Meanwhile, in the southern jungle, Yokoi was surviving. He had not withdrawn north with the main body of the retreating garrison. He had found hiding places in the terrain near Talafofo Falls, deep enough and remote enough that the clearing operations of late 1944 did not locate him. He was not alone initially. 2 other soldiers had survived the battle and were hiding in the same terrain. The 3 of them built a concealed shelter and sustained themselves on what the jungle provided: river shrimp, rats, edible plants, the small animals that a tropical jungle supports for a man willing to eat them. In 1964, a flash flood struck the area near their shelter. Both of Yokoi's companions died. He was alone from that point forward. The war had ended in August 1945. Information about the surrender had reached Guam through multiple channels. American broadcasts, leaflets dropped from aircraft, the visible transformation of the island into a major American military installation. Yokoi knew the war was over. He chose not to come out. He had internalized what the Japanese military code of that era taught about surrender with a completeness that did not yield to strategic reality. The war was lost. His obligation had not changed with its outcome. He stayed. He made his own tools from what the jungle provided. He wove his own clothing from tree bark. He maintained the discipline of a soldier without an army, the routine of a man who had decided that his understanding of his duty was not subject to revision because the strategic situation had changed. For 19 years after his companions died, he lived alone in a hand-dug tunnel near Talofofo Falls, on an island that the United States had declared secure in August 1944. On January 24, 1972, two hunters moving through the jungle encountered a man in the undergrowth. He was thin. He was wearing clothing made from woven bark. He was 56 years old. He had been in that jungle since 1944. When he was returned to Japan, he told reporters he was ashamed to have come back alive. Returning felt like a failure of the obligation he had carried into the jungle. He had not been embarrassed to survive. He had been surviving methodically and with discipline for 28 years. The shame was in the coming out, not in the staying. He lived in Japan until 1997. He was 82 years old when he died. He had spent 28 years in the jungle of an island the United States declared secure before he was found, and 25 more years in the country he returned to, and he had apologized for all of it. The Guam campaign produced 4 numbers that define it. 32 months of occupation, 21 days of battle, 1,744 Americans dead, 18,337 Japanese dead, and then one man. 28 years. Alone. Admiral Nimitz, writing after the war, described the Marianas as perhaps the most consequential acquisition of the entire Pacific campaign. Not because of the battles that took them, he wrote, but because of what they made possible. The Enola Gay departed from Tinian's North Field on August 6, 1945. The operation it executed had been planned in the command structure of which Guam was the center. The island that fell in 3 hours in December 1941 made possible the decision that ended the war in August 1945. Guam is American territory today, an unincorporated territory home to approximately 160,000 people, predominantly Chamorro. It hosts Naval Base Guam and Andersen Air Force Base, the military infrastructure that has made it one of the most strategically significant positions in the Western Pacific for 80 years. The reef at Asan Beach is still there. The coral ridges above the landing zone where the Japanese artillery positions were cut into the rock are still there, overgrown and weathered, but visible. The water at the reef edge where 20 LVTs burned on the morning of July 21, 1944, is clear. The distance between the official end of a war and what that war actually costs is not a number. It cannot be calculated. It is the distance between August 10, 1944, and January 24, 1972. Between a declaration of victory and the moment the last Japanese soldier on the island walked out of the jungle into the hands of the hunters who found him. 32 months of occupation, 21 days of battle, 28 years in the jungle. That is what one island cost. And the name of the tailor who paid the longest portion of that cost was Shoichi Yokoi, and he apologized for surviving it, and he was 82 years old when he finally stopped. What happens to a man after a war that never ended for him? 32 months of occupation, 21 days of battle, 18,337 Japanese dead, 1,744 Americans dead, and then one tailor alone in a jungle for 28 years after everyone else had gone home. We have spent 3 parts establishing what the Battle of Guam cost in numbers, the casualty ratios, the strategic consequences, the Chamorro people emerging from the hills after 32 months of occupation, the clearing operations that added another 8,500 Japanese deaths after the battle was officially declared over, the transfer of Pacific Fleet headquarters to Guam in January 1945, and the transformation of the island into the nerve center from which the Pacific War's final phase was prosecuted. But there is one question the numbers do not answer. What does it mean to fight a war that history has already finished? What does obligation cost a man when no one is left to receive it? And what did Shoichi Yokoi say when they finally found him in 1972? And why does what he said matter more than any of the casualty figures we have been quoting for 3 episodes? Yokoi was returned to Japan on February 2, 1972, 9 days after the hunters found him near Talofofo Falls. He was 56 years old. He weighed less than he should have. He was wearing clothing he had woven from tree bark, using skills he had developed over 28 years of manufacturing everything he needed from what the jungle provided. His tools were handmade. His shelter was a hand-dug tunnel reinforced with bamboo, invisible from the surface, located in terrain that American clearing operations had searched and passed through without finding him. He had maintained military discipline in that tunnel for 28 years. Not because he believed Japan was winning. He knew Japan had lost. He had known it since 1945. He stayed because his understanding of what a Japanese soldier owed the emperor did not change when the strategic situation changed. The obligation was the obligation. The outcome of the war was a separate matter. When his plane landed in Tokyo, he told the reporters waiting at the airport, "It is with much embarrassment that I return." He said he was ashamed to have survived when so many of his comrades had died on Guam. He said the shame was not in the hiding. The shame was in the coming back. Japan received him with the specific quality of attention that a story about extreme duration and impossible discipline produces in a country that values both. He was 56 years old and had spent half his life in a jungle eating river shrimp and rats, and he had come out of it maintaining a level of personal discipline and resourcefulness that most people cannot sustain for a week of camping. The Japanese public found in his story something that the post-war years of rapid economic development and cultural transformation had not provided: an uncomplicated example of the pre-war virtues of endurance and obligation preserved in amber in a jungle on an American island for 28 years. He married in 1972, the same year he returned. Her name was Mihoko Pangilinan. He had been engaged before the war, but his fiancée had not waited. Mihoko had. They lived together in Aichi Prefecture until his death in 1997 at age 82. He spent 25 years in post-war Japan, and by most accounts, he spent those years quietly giving occasional interviews, visiting Guam once more, before he died, standing on the ground near Talifofo Falls, where he had spent half his life. When he visited Guam in later years, he stood at the site of his tunnel and said he was grateful to the island for keeping him alive. He brought offerings for his dead companions, the two soldiers who had drowned in the 1964 flash flood. He had not been able to save them. The flood had come without warning in the night. They were gone before he understood what was happening. He had spent 19 years after that alone, and he said he had spoken to them every day. The thing that Yokoi's story illuminates about the Battle of Guam is not what it adds to the casualty figures. It is what it reveals about the distance between declaring a battle over and actually finishing it. General Geiger declared Guam secure on August 10, 1944. The United States Navy transferred Pacific Fleet headquarters to the island in January 1945. B-29s were flying from Guam's airfields by the summer of 1945. The Enola Gay's mission was planned from the command structure centered on Guam. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945. By every measure that military and political history uses to define the end of a conflict, the Pacific War ended in August 1945. In a tunnel near Talifofo Falls, the war ended on January 24, 1972. The strategic legacy of Guam's capture is not difficult to quantify. Admiral Nimitz wrote after the war that the Marianas as a whole represented perhaps the most consequential acquisition of the entire Pacific campaign, not because of the battles that took them, but because the reef is still there. The coral ridges above the beach where the Japanese artillery positions were cut into the rock are still visible, overgrown and weathered. The water at the reef edge where 20 LVTs burned in the first 60 seconds of the assault is clear. Shoichi Yokoi's tunnel near Talifofo Falls has been preserved and is accessible to visitors. There is a replica of the original structure. Tourists walk to it along a path through the jungle. Some of them know the story of the man who lived in it. Some of them do not. He died in 1997. He was 82 years old. He had survived the Battle of Guam, the clearing operations of late 1944, the death of his two companions in the 1964 flood, 19 years alone in the jungle. After that, the end of the war, he had not acknowledged repatriation. Marriage, 25 years of post-war Japanese life, and whatever it costs a man internally to have done what he did and felt about it the way he felt about it. He apologized for surviving. He said returning was embarrassing. He said he was ashamed. And in that shame expressed publicly, and without apparent reservation by a 56-year-old man in bark clothing standing in a Tokyo airport, is the full distance between what a war asks of the men it touches and what history is able to account for afterward. The casualty figures are accurate. The strategic analysis is sound. The Komoro testimony is documented. The dates and the unit designations and the artillery positions are all verifiable. None of it captures what it cost Shoichi Yokoi to walk out of that jungle. None of it captures what it cost the Chamorro families who gave their testimonies in August and September of 1944. None of it captures the 1,744 Americans whose names are on the memorial because of what they made possible. The harbor at Apra became the primary staging point for the naval advance against the Japanese home islands. The airfields on Guam Saipan and Tinian gave the Army Air Force's bases within B-29 range of the Japanese home islands for the first time. The operational decisions that ended the Pacific War were coordinated from Guam as much as from anywhere else on Earth. The island that Japan took in 3 hours in December 1941 became the platform from which the war was ended. That is a strategic irony so complete that it almost seems constructed. It was not constructed. It was the result of geography and of the Chamorro people who guided Marine patrols through jungle paths the military maps had never accurately shown, and of 1,744 Americans who died taking back the first piece of American territory occupied by a foreign power since the War of 1812. The Chamorro people are American citizens today, as they were in December 1941 when the Japanese arrived. Guam is an unincorporated territory of the United States, which means the Chamorro people hold American citizenship but cannot vote in presidential elections. This is a political fact that sits uncomfortably next to the historical fact of what 32 months of Japanese occupation cost them, and next to what their guidance and intelligence contributed to the battle that liberated them. The conversation about Guam's political status continues. The people who had that status weaponized against them during 32 months of occupation have been making that argument with more urgency in recent years. Their argument is not complicated. They were Americans when it mattered to be Americans. The full meaning of that status has not yet been resolved. The war in the Pacific National Historical Park preserves the sites across the island. Asan Beach, where the 3rd Marine Division came ashore at 8:28 a.m. on July 21st. 1944 is accessible from the park unit that overlooks the landing zone. At the war in the Pacific National Historical Park, each of whom had a life that the casualty ratio reduces to a unit of comparison. 32 months of occupation, 21 days of battle, 28 years in the jungle. These are the numbers. The story is what the numbers cannot hold. If this history matters to you, if the name Shoichi Yokoi matters, if the Chamorro people's 32 months matter, if understanding what one island actually cost beyond the official timeline matters, then share this with someone who should know it. Leave a comment telling us where you watched from. Every person who knows this story is one fewer person for whom Guam is only a dot on a Pacific map. The last Japanese soldier on Guam walked out of the jungle 28 years after the battle ended, apologized for surviving, and lived for 25 more years. History gave him 3 sentences. He deserved more. So did they all.